Looks like it's time.
Yeah.
All right, it is time. It is recording. Oh, I love that.
This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
So, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer, Courtney, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. It's a book club for the lovers of the Word made flesh. And today's Thursday, April 27th, and I'm Lee Bortons. This month, we've been discussing children's literature, and tonight we will discuss the book Little Britches, Father and I Were Ranchers. Next month, we're going to tackle 4 classics of American literature, Up From Slavery, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Harvey, and Born Again. And I just want to remind you, we do have some other book clubs. The Math Map, which is normally Monday nights, and of course the recordings are available to everybody anytime, is not going on for the summer. That's one of my clubs. It's just spring and fall. After the Words Aptly Spoken, which will go year round at 8 o'clock tonight on Thursdays, I meet with Kevin R. Novak, and we sponsor our host Unfragmented as a book club, where tonight we're finishing up Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I also have Monday nights. It's not a book club, it's a true podcast called Markers and Milestones. We're going to be promoting that more coming up soon. For about 8 weeks now, we've been talking to people who do other things than traditional college to get their training and education as young adults. And so I just invite you to listen to any of those and let your friends know about them. So where are we now? Jennifer, you're going to talk to me. I think you have some questions. Everyone's ready here. Julie's ready. Our producer, our guests are all on, our clubbers. Go for it, Jennifer.
All right. So Lee, I know that this is a personal favorite of yours. In fact, I think you own some artwork from the cover artist. So tell us why you love the book and maybe the art, if you feel like talking about that too.
Well, I almost grabbed the art from off the wall. Maybe I'll still do that while you guys are chatting about something. But I just love this book, I guess because I have boys and it's such a boy book, even though there's wonderful women throughout it. And then it just goes so well with like Laura Ingalls Wilder's, her true stories, and it goes so well with John Fitzpatrick and his books about the great brain. It's a time period that was really interesting, very classical, very family oriented in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And this is one that's transitions from the early 1900s to our own time period. So it's really interesting, I think, for families to know how recently people still live the same, whether they were rich or poor in the country or cities. They all had just a totally different work ethic. And so I love it for that reason. I also love it because, just God oozes through it in such a natural way. And hopefully we can talk about some of those incidents and the values that come out of it this evening as we go through the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So my firstborn is a boy, and he also loved this book. And I'm glad that you mentioned the work ethic, because one of the things that this book made Ben want to do was start to work outdoors when he was about 8. And he wanted to do all of the things that Ralph was getting to do. And some of them I just couldn't provide for him, but it did inspire us to make sure he had opportunities to do that. So
I don't know that any of our children don't want to be outside working with the animals and digging for lime caves and trying to find diamonds in the dirt. They all want to do that.
Yeah, and they all want to do adult things like Ralph did. So I love the title Little Britches is we have this saying about getting too big for your britches. Well, he is just right for his he wants to grow up and be a man. And so he's honored by being called Little Britches. He's allowed to be in the man's club because he works like a man, even though he's young. So that I think that's a precious. My husband was really good at treating our son that way, and I appreciated that. So, okay, so we've started every time this month with setting. So who, when, and where are these characters?
So they had just moved to a ranch in Colorado.
Yes.
And I know the Depression is somewhere in the middle. I don't know if I don't remember the date from the beginning or the end, but I know that 1929 happened somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think this very first book starts maybe back in 1906 or '08, something like that.
It's 06 when he is 8.
Yes.
I think something that gets overlooked, so I'll make sure you mention it. The reason they're in Denver is because the father worked in a woolen mill, which
Mhm.
wasn't good for his lungs. He was in East Rochester, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, one of those things that bridges that time period with our children. We had a woman across the street when Robert and John were young, who her brothers and sisters, all except for her, died because at a young age, because they all worked in wool factories.
Yeah.
And people, they didn't have windows, they didn't have air conditioning,
Yeah.
they didn't have any ventilation. And so we are old enough to have known people that are in this situation.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. So my great grandparents were born, they would have been, well, actually my great grandfather would have been the same age as Ralph. He was born in 1898. And so they had very similar lives to this story. And my husband and I were doing a little comparison chart in the car yesterday. We went on a business trip to Dallas. And so he's been listening to a lot of the book club books with me. And he said, wait, what part of Colorado they're in? He goes, because Eastern Colorado, because I was telling him about the water fight. And he said, yeah, that's pretty dry. And I was trying to decide, is it harder to be a farmer in Southwest Oklahoma, where my great grandparents were at this time? Or maybe was it harder in Colorado, or was it all the same? Kind of feels all the same, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's a good thing you just brought up, though, for a challenge A or B director who's trying to introduce these books to the children, is let them ask those kind of questions. Like, why was it so hard, the water issues here, and how's that compared to where our community meets?
Yeah. Yeah. And then you going right into science, right? Thinking about your local technology. So as I was looking at this, so we have we haven't named all the characters. So we've got the where, who's there?
This is hard. There's a new character introduced in almost every one of the 28 chapters.
I know.
So did anybody have maybe some favorites?
So while you're thinking, I asked my daughter to sum up the characters because she's in Challenge B this year. And she said, Ralph and his family, all their neighbors. I was like, that's a pretty good summary.
That's all of them. So I think it's nice to point out that there's 5 children: Ralph, Grace, Philip, Muriel, and Hal.
Mm-hmm.
And they are all very good friends, which is very different than what the world portrays now. And I think homeschoolers have recaptured is that your siblings can and actually should be your best friends.
Yeah. Well, I'll go. My father is my favorite character. I know we're probably going to talk about him a lot tonight, but I appreciate his hardworking, innovative, quiet, wise soul.
I mean, that's what made the next 6 books occur. It wasn't just this one book, but that young man, Ralph Moody, wanted all of us to know what his dad was like and how he'd formed him.
Yeah. And his legacy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Anybody else have a favorite that you want to mention?
I would agree that father is probably my favorite. I just love the strong male characters in here, from Fred Ostedt to High, even to Two Dog.
Yeah.
Even though Two Dog didn't speak, but just that relationship that they developed instantaneously was amazing to me. Just with the, putting his hand on his knee. Yeah. So, and I love Mother too. I mean, his mom was amazing, and all that she had to go through. Like when they arrived arrived out at the ranch, and they saw this little picture perfect house from the distance, and then as they got closer, and how it was just this dilapidated mess, and the way Charlie just took her in his arms and, you know, just comforted her. And then her resolve.
Yep.
No, this is what we came out here, and this is what we're going to do. And it didn't, I mean, it was just rough that the entire time that they were there just was, I mean, Ralph talks about good times, but I think that all of us can say that, you know, when we've been through the worst of times, those were also the best of times. Yeah. So
Yeah,
That's true.
that's good, Michelle. Yeah. In fact, at one point, Ralph says, I realized looking back that all of our best Christmases were the ones where we had the least.
Yeah.
So
It's like even Mrs. Cochran, and there's a couple other people that are like that, where they're just grumpy and not the nicest people. And yet, over time, Ralph always finds something to value in what they contribute to the community. So
yeah. And I lived also, Michelle, just thinking about all those men that you mentioned in his life. We talked with Amos Fortune and with Mr. Bowditch about that importance of mentors. And there's that strong theme in this too, where they take such an interest in him.
Well, and Mr. Cooper too, and bringing
Yep.
him out and allowing him to be a part of the roundup, and him putting the boundaries. When you're in my house, I'm in charge. When you're out on the roundup, then High is in charge. But when you are supposed to be with the what was his name? The
I think it's
chuck
Juan,
wagon
isn't
guy.
it? Is it Juan?
Yes. I can't remember. Anyway, but just how even he said, look, here is the structure. And I appreciated that, because so many times I think that we don't put those boundaries up that we're supposed to. And we all want them, right? We all want to know who's in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, which is good, because he had a lot of independence for a child his age, especially compared to what our kids would have. But it was good that he knew, you know, where those bounds were so that he could be freer within that. Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah,
point.
so maybe for our listeners to set it up as a reminder that he's between 8 and 12 years old in this first book in this series, and that I think there are 8 stories altogether. And so if you keep reading the series, we only read the first one in Classical Conversations, but if you keep reading them, he will bring you right into his era when he wrote these books as a 50-some-year-old man. So get to see how he continued to work hard his whole life.
Yeah, it's good.
So
the first time I read this, I don't remember crying. And this time I cried twice.
Me too. And I remember thinking, I know I didn't do that when I first read this aloud to my kids. I don't know what it was about this time.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because I had my AirPods in, and it was just, I was encapsulated in my own little world, listening to it. There was something about it. And then at the very end, I mean, I was just blubbering at the end, sitting at the dining room table. Anyway.
It might be because we're getting older, and these memories that we made with our children, you know, or some of them are very similar to the book. We might not have been as poor or as out in the country as they are, but we had good memories with them.
Yeah.
Something that I wanted to ask you about, Jennifer, and I don't know if it's fair in the Freytag pyramid world of literature to how you would answer this. But as I went through, I started to realize that there's 2 other kinds of characters that aren't people, which isn't unusual in literature, right? You have Harry, who's the Potter woman's first name? I would say Harry, and her rabbits.
Oh, Beatrix.
Beatrix Potter, right? So rabbits can be characters, but this is a story about people. And yet these people are so dependent on 2 other characters, the animals at their farms and the crops that they grow. And so many of the stories are about the crops.
Yeah. So my husband, as you know, is into economics, and he's a wealth advisor. So when we were talking about this and talking about all of their calculations of their crops, he was reflecting on the immense proportion of labor that went into feeding your family in those days versus the very small percentage of our money that we now have to spend on food and clothing. It's a big deal. It is most of their working hours just to feed them and clothe them. And so we had that interesting reflection that they really are. So as I might situate those characters as part of this setting, because we talked before about how your setting helps you and hinders you. And so I would say the animals and the crops do both of those things, don't they? They help and hinder. So.
Yeah. So I have a question that, I mean, I honestly read this book today, so I read it fast in order to review it. Mame, mother.
Mhm.
We know Charles Moody, we know Mrs. Moody. He calls her Mame, the kids call her mother. Was there ever a name given to her? I could not find it.
Oh, they did tell her name, and I don't remember now what it was.
No.
She tells it one time.
Well, I didn't
I
find
thought it was Mary.
It might be.
Maybe.
I would believe
I don't
anything you
remember.
said.
Because I was listening to the book, and as I was cleaning my house today. My husband appreciates that, by the way. But so I don't have the location in the book to even to know, but I think I remember it was Mary, because she was telling, it was towards the beginning, they were telling each other, the neighbors were telling what to call her.
Yes.
Oh, so I just missed it. And Mame and Mary Mame's kind of like mother and Mary together.
Kind of makes sense. Well,
okay.
maybe we'll find it before we get off.
Yeah.
So I think
All right,
this. Oh, did you have a question, Lee?
Well, no, I was going to say some other characters, but if you want to move on, we can.
No, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
So let's see. The headmaster at the school, the greengrocer,
Mhm.
the cartman who brought the copper pots, and the tinkerer, I don't remember what his
Yeah.
name was. So it's really interesting to me, all not just the farming neighbors, but the merchant neighbors who were part of his mentorship.
Yeah. And then of course, every story has to have some bad guys. So some of the bad guys aren't people in this. Weather is a bad guy.
Mhm.
And then the guys who steal the water are the other kind of villains in the story.
Do you want to go over that story? It's the second time you brought it up, so catch up our listeners.
Yeah.
What happened with the water fights?
Oh, well, and that brings up another character, which is their cousin Phil, who helps them get this ranch and apparently did not do his homework and find out that there was not enough water for this ranch. And so they're at the end of the creek, right? And the people up at the top, the head of the water, take more than their fair share. And so father invents all these devices. I had forgotten this until this rereading. He invents devices to control the water flow. And then when they can, and it resolves it for 1 year. And then the next year, these guys come back and try to take more of their fair share of water again. And so he makes a recording device out of a can and a piece of paper and a pencil where he's recording that they're taking too much water so he can take them to court. So it's an interesting fight for resources.
Maybe I swear she says resources, seems like it's another character. So, and the food just stands out to me because when they fight, like the first half of the book, he doesn't complain that there's not enough. There's not enough, but he doesn't complain. Then all of a sudden there's 19 pigs and there's oranges at Christmas, right? And there's all the fixings with the ham, and chapter after chapter in the last half, it's all about the food that they have. The hunger is gone.
Yeah, and there's the one scene where he goes into great detail about Bessie Altland feeding the hands that were haying, and the description of the dishes goes on and on. It's which reminds me of my grandfather when that's one of his fond memories of childhood too, is those big meals where they would feed all the hands that came to help on the farm. Those are some of his favorite memories too.
Yeah. So I'm old enough to remember we would get oranges in our stocking, not because we were poor, but because everybody was poor. There were no oranges in Northern Maryland in December when I was under 10. That's how quickly it's changed. And so
Yeah.
when you have to live as close to the land as this kid did, no wonder he's so competent.
Yes. And their lives really are bounded by those rhythms of the season, the
Mhm.
seasons, right? They ate certain foods at certain times of year. And I was thinking about that one year when I was tutoring Challenge 2, because one of the things that Swift makes fun of on Laputa is the scientists who are trying to grow fruits out of season. I was like, wonder what Swift would think of us.
You're talking about Gulliver's Travels for those
Yeah.
that don't know what book you're talking about. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So I know we have to do our sponsorship soon, but I wanted to talk about one more thing real quick, which is that, and you kind of alluded to it at the beginning, Lee, that this story, because it is an autobiography, doesn't follow the normal plot arc. It's what we would probably usually call episodic, so that each chapter pretty much has this entire chart going on in it. Each chapter has its own setting and rising action and climax and characters and falling action and theme, in the sense that it has a different lesson that Ralph has learned. So I wanted to hear from you guys if you have a favorite episode in the book. And I will tell you, my challenge 3 students this week, I mentioned that I was discussing this book, and one of my students looked up and he goes, "Is that the one where he breaks 9 of his toes?" I said, "Yep, that would be the book."
Yeah, I remember. So while you guys are thinking, let me thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023, lose my words, Words Aptly Spoken Book Club's calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC book site. So visit and plan to join many of our book clubs. Next week's book club, like I said earlier, is on Thursday, May 4th. We will discuss Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington. You know, and a lot of these books that we're reading in a row here are autobiographical and are, set in historical time periods that are really interesting. So I welcome you to come in next week. And now Jennifer wants us to talk about our favorite stories. But I'm wondering, and if one of us has a favorite story, you jump in and do that, or you can do yours, Jennifer. But I'm just wondering, for the person who watches this later, if we want to take one of these stories and actually talk about maybe the page numbers and how you said each of the episodes has the Freytag's pyramid in it.
Yeah.
Is that what you were planning to do?
I wasn't planning to, but we certainly can. So do you have a favorite one that you want to share?
Well, what about does somebody else have one? I'm willing to do the 9 toes one.
Donna, you look like
I
you
like
had
the
one.
one where he trapped a pheasant. It's a short one, but
Oh, yes.
Let's do that one.
and then he
Good.
had to meet the sheriff.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's back up to our chart, Julie, if you'll put our pyramid back up. So tell us about that one. You know, summarize the action of it for us, Donna.
So
What
he
page? What page is that on?
I have
155.
no idea. I'm looking.
Chapter
is it?
19.
What?
Chapter
Chapter
19.
19. Okay.
Pheasants.
Thanks, Lee.
So
I love this.
so yeah, that was, I think it's before 19, because he meets the sheriff in 17 is where it says, but he had gotten a trap and he was trying to trap, was it prairie dogs, I believe, and he had remembered a conversation that shooting a pheasant in Colorado was apparently very illegal and they couldn't do it. So, and he goes out, he was very anxious and excited about his trap. He had put it out the day before that morning and he couldn't wait to bring the cows in so he could go check his trap, even though Dad had said, don't check it all the time. So you can, so it doesn't scare things away. But he goes out and he finds that it's a pheasant, and then he runs through all these different scenarios in his head. Okay, how can I hide it? I can just throw it in the canyon and the coyotes will get it. Well, what if they don't want to eat feathers? And then he starts to pluck it, and he just goes through, and then he finally just comes to himself and he tells his dad the truth. And so he goes ahead, I think he brought it with him, and his dad said, well, now you have to go tell the sheriff and see what the sheriff says. And so he goes to tell the sheriff. He finds him in the saloon, which he's not sure mom's gonna like him going into the saloon, but he's going in to see the sheriff, so it's got to be okay. So he goes in, kind of stands, I think, I feel it's like demurely by the side because, nobody's introduced him and he's not big enough to make noise enough for the sheriff to hear him. So he waits. The bartender says, hey, there's a kid here for you. And he tells the sheriff the situation. The sheriff takes the pheasant and examines him. And he says, well, the law is you can't shoot him, so you're fine. But then he also has this conversation about like, why did you tell the truth? And the sheriff is kind of like, why, and he thinks it almost sounded to me like kind of sounds like he's talking to him. His dad's a little crazy for making him do this, but, he's also proud of him. So it was just an interesting juxtaposition of dad versus sheriff. You would think sheriff would be the one with the higher mind, but it was dad.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
You're right.
good.
It's chapter 17. Just
Okay.
catching up.
Yeah. So I think if I'm not misremembering, I think he was trying to trap rodents of some kind that were getting into their crops.
Mhm.
And instead he caught the pheasant. So he was trying to solve one problem. He created another problem, which so often happens. So do you think then, Donna, would you say that the judge's ruling is the climax of it?
I would think the conversation with the sheriff when he's examining it.
Yeah, sorry, I meant the sheriff.
So yeah, when the sheriff is examining the pheasant to see because the sheriff was like, oh, I thought you were just coming to cover up your dad's mistake of shooting one.
Yes.
So, because he's like, there's got to be something backhanded about this. So, yeah, it was just, but I think him examining it, and then it's kind of like, okay, he's examined it, and then we know that's the kind of the falling action is then what happened, the conversation afterwards.
Yeah. So then
Yeah.
what would we call the theme then? What's the lesson, do you think, of this particular story in the book?
Tell the truth.
Right.
Wait, I don't remember. Dad had a phrase for it. And I know.
But there was a place where the father explains a sermon and tells the son, I just want you to be an honest man. And that's why I explained the sermon to you. I mean, he does it a couple of different times, but I don't remember the phrase.
And he repeated it later in the.
Well, I have it in here upcoming. So
What is it?
it's about his character house. Is that what you were thinking of, where he
Oh,
doesn't want him to tear boards off of it?
No,
It's a
it was
different
something
sermon.
It was, it was specifically about telling the truth before you get caught, kind of.
Well, on page 147, at there's the last paragraph before the break in the page, it says, he said it would be good for me as I grew older to know that a man always made his troubles less by going to meet them instead of waiting for them to catch up with him or trying to run away from them.
That's it.
I love that. I
Excellent.
blue lined it.
Yes, that's definitely a memorable blue highlighting. I love that, Michelle. That you said that.
It's so odd as well. Like even back then you think, oh, people would only laugh at telling the truth now. But even back then it was startling to the sheriff that a dad would hold their child accountable to do the right thing and to go, do what they ought to do. So.
well, the
Yeah.
sheriff's probably used to people shooting things to feed themselves and doesn't really quite think that badly of it.
Right. Yeah, that's
But-
true too. Mhm.
Yeah. And so what a surprise to find out someone really is holding to the law.
And it's also interesting in this chapter that when Ralph is told to go, he wants his dad to go with him. And his dad will not go with him.
Yeah. He's got to do it himself. I
Mhm.
also thought it was really funny that he thought he was going to get a shot of brandy, and then it was
Yes.
it was birch beer.
They gave him birch
which-
beer.
which
I
he
gave
still
him birch
wasn't
beer,
sure.
yeah.
He said, I didn't know if mother would want me to drink it. Sheriff says it was all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's just all this
the-
humor in it.
The other line that that he said, and this is 146 right above the picture. I told them then what Father had said about our prisons being full of men who ran away from the law, but that time nobody laughed. So it was the prisons are full of men running from who ran away from the law. That
Mhm,
was the other one.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it had lots of good quips and sermons.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing about it though. It's like, I didn't think the book was ever preachy.
No.
It
No,
was always appropriate for the situation.
Mm-hmm.
well, it brought back to me, it's because I was listening to something about classical education this morning, one of the podcasts, and just the great books. That's what, this one is very easy to kind of ease into. That great books
Mm-hmm.
gives you those morals, and that's why we do classical and why we read these great books, is that we can run our kids through these situations without our kids having to go through these situations. And so it has story after story for that. And I think no matter who you are, girl, boy, mom, child, you can resonate with someone in this book. And I think and we can all get the story. I think, the lesson I got from the whole book was mom never gave up on their education, no matter where they went, how it was. Mom, school's out for a month, we're doing school. You
Yeah.
come home from school, you do school. She never gave up on that. She was the everyday educator. So
Yeah.
It's
One of
good
the,
to.
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say stories like this, just very human, and it gives the opportunity for parents to share a testimony of a situation that they went through that is similar to him. So it allows our kids to get to know us as
Mhm.
we're reading characters, of a time when we were kids. There used to be in candies, there was Frank's Nursery and Craft Store that my mom loved to go in. And there was a candy, they just had like this candy shelf that was just sitting in the aisle with Brock's candy individually wrapped. And I just thought, oh, that must be for kids who come in with their moms. And so I loaded my pockets. I mean, loaded them. Get to the car and I'm pulling out all this candy. And my mother was like, where did you get that? And I said, well, it was in the store in the center thing. And she goes, Julie, you have to pay for that. And I'm like, well, it was out. And so she made me walk back in, with 3 empty wrappers and then the rest. And the lady, was just like, you can keep it, thank you for being honest. And so anyway, it gives you a chance to share something that you did when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's good.
So, well, just how far we've come. So if you guys been looking at the videos of the new Target in San Francisco, and how everything is behind a locked plexiglass,
Yeah.
everything. You have to tell them what you want and they go get it for you.
Yeah.
wow,
It's exact opposites happening now.
total
Yes.
lack of trust.
Mhm.
Right. Which unfortunately has been earned by the
Mhm.
behavior of some. So
Yeah.
who didn't have
Which-
the boundaries that, yeah.
I wanted to blame it on Julie.
Oh, I wanted to go back to one thing you said, Lee, about it not being preachy. So I think that the best literature shows instead of telling. And so partly how this works is because Father is quiet in his discipline, and it's more of an impact, but also, in each of these chapters, and when you read them aloud with your kids, they know who they want to be like and who they don't want to be like. And it's like fairy tales work that way too, right? You know which characters you want to emulate and which ones you should not be like. And that is similar to Father's instruction. It's this quiet moral instruction of example.
Mhm. It's also one of the scenes I think is one of my favorites is when so the mother is always asking the father to spank him.
Yes.
And it's because she loves him and he
Yes.
does things that are deadly dangerous,
Yes.
right? Because that's the world they live in. And she wants him to be that, to feel the pain on his butt rather than end his life, right? So
Yes.
it's really hard for people to fathom that don't live in dangerous situations.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, she overreacts. And so the father figures out a way to spank him that doesn't hurt.
Yes. He makes it noisy but painless occasionally in order to. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's such a real family.
It
Uh-huh.
is, yeah. And
That's
he does
great.
do some really risky things, like the night that he rides up into the canyon to find Two Dog
Uh-huh.
and bring him down to, cure their horse. That's a gigantic risk for a little boy.
Yeah.
And the family doesn't know where he is. And of course, that's the first thing that Mr. Thompson says when he gets him into their dwelling is, do your parents know where you are?
You are really far from home.
Yes. So,
But even that, the modeling on page like 134, it's one of the many examples where the children are doing their lessons at night.
mhm,
And mom and dad are at the table too, doing the math, trying to figure out seeds per
Mhm.
crop and the cost of the seeds.
mhm.
And so they're just constantly, they just do things as a family. And it's like what I think homeschooling really is that you go about your life as an adult and you just make sure your children are always nearby watching what you do. And that's the heart of homeschooling. Because we love our children, we also take time away from what's important to us to make sure they can read and can do some math and can, analyze Latin. So we make those sacrifices also. But the better part of it is the modeling that we get to do with our children.
Yeah. And one of the precious things for me in here that I had forgotten until this read is that mother's always reading aloud to them on winter
Mhm.
evenings or when they go on weekend picnics. And she's no slouch. She's reading Shakespeare. She's quoting William Cullen Bryant's poetry by memory. And one of the scenes that I loved is when father's trying to make some meaning out of something. And he quietly turns to her and says, "What's that thing that you read to us from Hamlet?" And she says, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rescue them how we will." It's one of the moments where you see God all over it, and father
Mhm.
can't quite find the words, but mother has them there for him. And I thought that was a precious picture of their relationship because they really are such good partners in life and rearing their children and, being truly being one another's helpmates. So,
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left. What is it you want us to cover with Freytag's pyramid? Because we got off track a little bit. And then I want to know, what are we saying about the ending?
okay, yes. So, well, let's
Or-
back up and start at the beginning. So we've been talking the past few weeks about how characters try to get something and they face all these obstacles. And that's something that a writer crafts. Right. And so it's a little different when you have an autobiography where it's not being crafted. You are just representing all the story. And I'll try to tie that together a little better than what I'm saying. I was reading a book called The Manual of the Art of Fiction. He was talking about the fact that artists must do this. They must select and telescope because the only person who can make meaning out of the actual everyday events of life is God himself. because he only can see that much at a time. And so we try to make meaning by telescoping and drawing this kind of pyramid with our stories. So I was trying to think, what is it that we would say that Ralph wants? And I wonder if there's a clue in the opening line. So this is the opening sentence. "I never really knew father very well till we moved to the ranch on Fort Logan, Morrison Road, not far from Denver." It's a pretty simple opening. What do you guys think about this as an opening sentence?
Well, especially with the ending, it's the perfect clincher. He
Mm-hmm.
wanted to
Yeah.
know his father well.
Yep.
That's what we all want, right?
Yeah. And I think that when his dad calls him partner, to me, that was like God's well done to us.
Yeah.
Well done, good and faithful servant. I'm going to call you partner in this
Mhm.
case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he calls
And
him
halfway-
partner and he calls him a man. I think that comes later.
Mhm.
You know, so he kind of moved him up. So he's partner first, but then he became
Mhm.
a man later.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's
And at one
good.
point he even says, I know you're going to be a good man.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, that's one thing about,
So
our children and raising them and being parents, unless something horrible happens and they pass on and break our hearts, they will grow up. They will become men and they will become
Mhm.
women. We can't stop it, but we want them to become good men and good women, which
Mhm.
has its root in the word God.
Yeah.
And the mom even says towards the end, she says, "You are my man now." So she's calling him a man.
Mhm.
So it kind of came full in there.
Yes. And she certainly would not have said that at the beginning.
No.
She's very frustrated that he is such a foolish little boy. It is a constant worry for her. She's trying to
Mhm.
keep him alive, for one thing.
Yeah.
Well, so should we? I feel like as a group, we want to discuss the end. So, how about this solution? How about I tell you, if you're listening and you haven't finished the book, now would be the moment for you to stop the recording if you don't want to know how the book ends. I am loudly saying, spoiler alert, stop listening. Okay, now we can talk about the end.
Okay, that's all right.
All right.
So, why don't we just read a couple of the passages?
Good.
Does anybody have, without going to the very last paragraph, does anybody have something in the middle, like around 254 to 58 that we want to read before we read the last two paragraphs?
Everyone's scanning. I didn't
Yeah.
get up here.
I think so. They had already moved. They were no longer on the ranch at this point. And so at the bottom of 257, just the attendance at the funeral. All of our old neighbors from the ranch were at Father's funeral, and I never knew until then how much they really cared for him.
Mm.
Good. I was thinking about, while Father was still alive, he says, page 255 at the top. Father chuckled a little when he got up from the table and he rumpled my hair. We Moody's are tough fellows, aren't we, son? And then he goes on to look at the mother and says, don't worry, ma'am, I'm not sick. I'm just scratched up a little. This job will only take half a day and there's $3 in it. So he doesn't even know what's about to happen to him.
Yeah.
He's still taking care of him.
One of the things that I loved about how it circled back around is that for the first time, and Ralph says, I don't know if he knew this or not, but for the first time, he told us about his childhood. And so I thought that was such a blessing to them to get to hear Father's stories. And then you learn that he also grew up in unbelievably difficult circumstances with deaf mute parents. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that just rounds out his character. And it also answers, Ralph's wish at the beginning that he did get to know him.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh.
Okay, so Jennifer, do you want the privilege of reading the last two paragraphs?
Well, I
think
can't
you should
because
have
I
it.
didn't bring my copy up here. So
Oh.
you'll have to do
Okay.
it.
Unless Michelle, you want to read it?
Oh, okay. Hopefully I can get through it without blubbering. That first supper, that first supper was the most memorable meal of my life. The big yellow mixing bowl sat in the middle of the table, filled to the brim, told you,
I know.
with well-browned pieces of chicken stewed until it was almost ready to fall off the bones, whole potatoes and carrots, with big puffy dumplings mixed at the bedside, floating on top. Father had always said grace before meals, always the same 25 words. And the ritual was always the same. Mother would look around the table to see that everything was in readiness. Then she would nod to Father. That night, she nodded to me, and I became a man.
So I want to encourage you, Michelle, because there are many books that I cannot read without crying. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it is good for our children to see that. In fact, for years when I was doing Challenge 2 and we would get to something beautiful for God, there were certain passages I could not get through with my students without crying. And that is good for them to see that our hearts also are moved. That is a good example. So thank you for persevering through the tears and reading to us. So,
When I tutored A, and we were talking about Martin Luther King, and I started reading I Have a Dream, and I just completely lost it in front of my 10 students. But I just, I got through it, but just that emotion of that speech and thinking about what what Reverend King was trying to share. So anyway, many a times I've cried in front of my classes.
yeah.
And my kids see it too.
Yeah.
Well, and I put this, I know we're out of time, but I put this
That's okay.
quotation on the screen. This is, oh, sorry, that one you had, Julie. That this is from William Cullen Bryant's poem Thanatopsis that Mother has recited to them. And so they also refer to this, particularly that first line. So live that when your summons comes, you can lie down to pleasant dreams. And so I loved it that Father taught him to live and die well. And because they recited this poem together as a family, there was that preparation for that moment.
So just a side note, William Cullen Bryant is my great uncle.
Wow, that's cool.
Wow.
My maiden name is Lee Ann Bryant.
Oh, that's lovely.
Oh, I have lots of stories about his legacy. No, I never met him. I was too many generations back.
Wow. What a great legacy. And look at that.
Look at that. All right. Well, we're out of time. Thank you for that. And thank you for those who cried with us.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
All right. Bye.
Thank
All right.
you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.